So you want to read classic books. You've compiled lists. You've gone into stores to browse, maybe even purchased some, but you just don't know if you're the kind of person who can read classics, who can get through them, because they're dense and challenging. Most people avoid classic books for one reason. They think that they're hard. So you're not alone. There's dense language, long paragraphs, confusing storylines, sometimes a bunch of transcendental philosophy just thrown in there for what appears to be no reason, if you're Moby-Dick as an example. It feels like work, not like reading. And it can be challenging, but the truth is, some of the most famous classics are actually very easy to read. And once you start, they're addicting. They're hard to put down. So it's not true that classics are all dense and long and difficult. I wouldn't recommend starting with Finnegans Wake for sure, but there are classics that are absolutely worth reading, easy to read, and accessible. So if you've ever wanted to get into classics, here are five books that I would recommend that will make you realize it's way easier than you think. The first of them is a famous book written by an author who has several works that I can recommend. He arguably could be one of the great American writers of all time. And this work is Of Mice and Men. And Of Mice and Men, it's a fantastic work by John Steinbeck. It's almost written like a play. Of Mice and Men, it's very short, and it's emotionally gripping from the very, very beginning. It's the kind of book that you could read in one sitting. You can sit down, you can finish it. It's also the kind of book that will hit harder a lot of times in terms of the emotional payoff, in terms of the meaning, than some of these other classics, these 400 or 500 page classics that you've been told you're supposed to read your whole life. Um, we could do a whole biographical thing on Steinbeck. For the interest of time, we won't. He was a Nobel Prize winner in literature. Of Mice and Men is set in, you guessed it, California. One of the places that Steinbeck is most notable for setting all of his stories or most of his stories in Southern California, where he grew up. And this story is really inspired by that setting. And essentially, the premise is there's two migrant workers, and they're chasing a simple dream during the Great Depression. One of these workers um, has some challenges, and the other is trying to help him along. It's an emotionally riveting story. It gives you a lot of insight into the human character. It's deeply influential, a gateway into classics, and it really influenced the modern minimalist dialogue approach, right? There's a lot of books now. One of the ones that comes to mind to me is Cormac McCarthy's um, uh, No Country for Old Men, which is very almost like reading a novel or reading a play rather than a novel instead. But a lot of other works deeply influenced by this minimalism. And it pairs very well with reading one of his other big works, The Grapes of Wrath. I would say Of Mice and Men is probably, depending on the day, Steinbeck's second or third best work. It's really easy to read because it's dialogue heavy, linear story structure. Great start, great recommendation for a first book to start with if you're looking for an accessible book. The second one, this one is written by Ernest Hemingway, another fantastic writer. I mentioned in one of my earlier videos that T.H. Lawrence famously said that Moby-Dick was the greatest book written about the sea. I think that this is arguably the greatest novella written about the sea, and it is The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. It might be the simplest deep book that has ever been written, in my opinion. I mean, Hemingway is an amazing writer, and everything by Hemingway is worth reading. He's one of those rare writers who you can read his short stories, Hills Like White Elephants, or you could read all the way into his longest novels. In particular, I love For Whom the Bell Tolls. One of, probably, in my opinion, arguably his best novel, but that's not the conversation for today. The Old Man and the Sea, it's really known for its simple prose. It's almost feels like I mean, Hemingway's always kind of writing like that because of his experiences as a war correspondent, his kind of belief that you should write what you know, that kind of thing. Another Nobel Prize winner. Um, but The Old Man and the Sea, the premise of it is this fisherman who's had struggles. He's not been able to bring home fish for a long time. He's fighting a giant marlin, but he's also fighting himself. It's man versus nature, technically, but really it's man versus self. and it's a fantastic story. Again, another one that defined minimalism, influenced so many other writers, cornerstone of 20th century literature. Extremely simple sentences because you got Hemingway, and it's a very focused story, so very easy to read. Another one I'd highly recommend to start with, maybe even more accessible than Of Mice and Men. Third book. This is a really great one. So, if I was starting from scratch and I wanted to find a book that is adventurous, it's fun, it's exciting, it's accessible, and it can still be considered squarely within the realm of classics, one of my top choices would be Jack London's Call of the Wild. Now, White Fang and some of his other works are fantastic, but Call of the Wild is perhaps his most condensed work. It bang for your buck. It's very good. It's short. It's got a wonderful narrative, wonderful story, easy to follow. It's fast paced. It's an adventure story. It's about animals, so I think that reason it's very lovable, and a lot of people come back to this book again and again. I remember the first time I read this one as well, and I think this is one of those books that you'll remember where you read it because it just is so engaging, engrossing. You feel like you're there while you're reading it. It's got a lot of oomph to the pace. And it's a kind of classic that, as I said, it kind of pulls you straight in, but it doesn't slow down. So because of that, you kind of remember what you were doing when you read it. Jack London has also a lot of really interesting biographical details. He drew heavily from his experiences living up in the Yukon as a gold prospector, but he also was, he was in a sailor. He was on boats and adventures. Like he went on a lot of adventures. So really interesting guy as well to look at his biographical details. One of the most famous adventure stories ever made. Classic man versus wild narratives, even though it's you know man slash animal versus wild, I would say, better way to put it. And then if you love it, you can read White Fang, and that's another great work, great classic that I think will be, this one feels very movie-esque, so I think that's a cool element to that in our modern world, pulling that in. Another recommendation I would highly recommend to start. Number four. So, um, you know, you already know this idea, but the story is way simpler than you think. You've heard this story before. It's a story of a man who, on some days, he might be Dr. Jekyll, and on other days, he might be Mr. Hyde. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Okay? By Robert Louis Stevenson, famous Scottish writer. Um, you know, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is great because it's actually so short. I have it right here. But this book, this is really not all Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Let's see. It's like, oh, it's less than that. Like it's that much of the book, right? So it's a really short read as well. And this is an interesting, the Penguin Classics edition because it comes with a series of other tales as well. Some of those, like the Body Snatcher, is quite interesting. So that might be worth purchasing if you're interested, because then you can read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde if you really like it. There's other books, other stories in there that you can read as well. But it's a great place to start because it's a classic story. A lot of people have heard of it. It defined a genre as well. Lots of stories today, like The Incredible Hulk, for example, directly, influenced by that. The idea of any story, basically that premise of a guy on one day he's the genius scientist, and then at night he becomes this monster kind of character. That's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That's where that came from. It reads like this psychological thriller, not like an old classic, which is really cool as well, because even though it's older, it's got some Victorian language, it really feels, again, like an adventure, like a psychological thriller. And I think part of the reason for that is Robert Louis Stevenson was just known for being an adventure writer. I mean, Treasure Island is one of his other most famous works. Another one, or Kidnapped, that you could definitely include on a list like this as accessible classics that I would totally recommend starting with, that show that classics don't have to be, Ulysses or Finnegans Wake as much as Joyce is cool, or Search of Lost Time, or À la recherche du temps perdu. I don't remember what it is in English, but Proust. It doesn't have to be something like that, right? It could be something, way more fun and short. Not that those books are not can't be fun, but they're challenging and difficult. I think you guys know what I'm talking about. Um, this also had a very deep influence in the dual personality trope, as I mentioned, and the phrase Jekyll and Hyde. That's another thing here. That came directly from this, of course, and is something that you hear used universally. Um, so I would say that all of those books are fantastic. Book five here is maybe the most accessible book, probably the number one that I would include. If I was starting, I wanted to see a classic, one that I love, that is short, that's really accessible, easy to understand. I would choose The Pearl by John Steinbeck. Now, if you needed a testament to how amazing Steinbeck is as a writer, that he has two entries on this list today, but he truly is one of the great writers. Probably, in my opinion, one of the great 20th century writers, maybe the great American writer, or some of his novels are contenders for the great American novel at the very least, possibly two. And I wouldn't include Grapes of Wrath among those two. So that would be my controversial take here. But East of Eden and Of Mice and Men, honestly, I think could be up there depending on the day. It can make an argument for that. But The Pearl is super short and sweet. It's accessible. It's probably one of the easiest classics to understand, but it's also one of the ones that will stay with you the most. It's super simple structure and very symbolic, which is exactly what you want in a classic, right? You want something that's short, emotional, symbolic, that kind of stays with you. And the premise of the story, it's in Mexico, and there's this poor fisherman. He finds this pearl. He thinks it's going to change his life. And of course, it does change his life, but not in the way that he expected. Classic, right? Super simple, super easy idea to understand, but exactly how the story unfolds, there's so much there. It's so much, and it's used a lot of times in education, because of all the symbolism, the themes of greed and fate and human nature, and it really does connect with Steinbeck's social commentary. But I think it connects with this more interesting social commentary. Little tangent here. From my perspective, Steinbeck has two kind of themes of social commentary that are both quite interesting. One is the more political side, which you see in Grapes of Wrath, and the other is the more eternal, human, deeper, more mature exploration of good and evil, which you see more in books like East of Eden. You see a bit of both in The Pearl, and I actually think it's more of a East of Eden type book, which is what I love about it. And that's also part of the reason why I'm not as don't get me wrong, the Grapes of Wrath is a fantastic read. I just don't think it's quite at the same level as East of Eden, because it's less mature. It's early Steinbeck before he starts, realizing that the simple political commentary stuff, as interesting as that is, the deeper human good and evil commentary, that's really what Steinbeck will become known for, and I think for good reason. And The Pearl has that, which is something that gives it that extra sweet flavor. And I think it's a great place to start. So that's number five. Super short length, almost feels like a fable. Now I have a bonus here for everyone who's still with us that wants to go a little bit deeper. They're still looking for accessible classics, but in this case, something that's very short, but not necessarily easy. Something that is accessible in its length, accessible in the sense you could sit down and read it in one setting. I think it's only 72 pages or something, depending on the edition. And that is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. So, Conrad was famously, he wrote in English as his third language, and he worked as a sailor. He was known for a lot of psychological and morally complex stories. But most of his other stories, as interesting as they are, pale in comparison to um, Heart of Darkness when it comes to classics. Heart of Darkness is his magnus opum, a lot of people would argue. The premise, a man travels into the African Congo to find this mysterious ivy trader. His name is Kurtz, and he confronts kind of everything, the deep darkness that can exist within human nature. This is the story that inspired Apocalypse Now, the famous Vietnam War movie. And it really shaped, I think, the modern psychological view of colonialism. You could say that this would be one of the proto anti-colonialist narratives. Um, it's not that it would be too simplistic to say that's what it is in its essence, but it definitely inspired that genre as a small kind of offshoot of, among many other things, what Heart of Darkness did. But Heart of Darkness is very much worth reading because it's one of the most analyzed works in literature. You hear about it in literature classes all the time. My My aunt taught high school literature for years, and she would read this book with her class as well. And I know a lot of times in college, this is another thing that's very common. It's short. It's got this very simple journey, right? He goes down the river. It's got a clear structure. He's going deeper and deeper into the heart of the Congo, away from civilization. And at the same time, he's progressing deeper and deeper into the heart of darkness, both physically and metaphorically, away from, again, the comforts of civilization. But I love it because it's really not simple, right? You could look at it and say that it is an anti-colonialist work of literature. You could also look at it and say that he was it wasn't so anti-colonialist, um, but it had kind of a deep moral approach that is similar to the way that modern anti-colonialist writing would be. So regardless of where you fall on any issue, any way of viewing things, you can get something out of Heart of Darkness. And for that reason, and that's really why we read classics, right? Because they're not stories that just have a point. You don't just read a classic and say, "Oh, I got it. I know what it's about." The reason we want to read classics is because they have so much depth, so much richness to them, in addition to just what they're about. They could be about many things. And so Heart of Darkness, I would say, is really that next level, accessible, short classic you could read in one sitting, but still something that, gets you a bit more depth, a bit more taste of what the more difficult classics will start to require from you as you progress. Now, the reason all these books are easy is not because they're shallow. It's because great writers have learned how to say more with less. That's the theme here. That's the unifying theme of all these short novels, these short classics. They have such great writers and such great stories that they've been able to do a lot with a little. So if you've been put off of classics because you think they're difficult, I want you to know that that's not always the case. The truth is, reading is not hard. You just haven't found the right entry point yet. And if you read any of these, or if you have a classic you think should be on a list, drop it in the comments. I'm always looking for the next one, and I've already found several classics, several books from other recommendations from you guys. So I really appreciate that. And if you can like and subscribe, I really appreciate that. It helps me with everything we're doing here. God bless, and thank you guys for watching this video.